So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our 9 to 9 Siyum. I am thrilled that you have joined us today. I think this will be a really wonderful event, and we're very excited to celebrate this amazing achievement of reading through all of Tanach, one chapter at a time. Of course, we are primarily here to celebrate Rachel Danziger's accomplishment, and I have a few words ahead of her getting started. In Parashat Truma, which was read this past Shabbat, Moses is instructed to put the testimony, the edut, in the ark once it is constructed. In his commentary on Exodus 40:20, where this term edut reappears, Rashi explains that these are the tablets that Moses brought down from the mountain with the 10 commandments written on them. This same word, of course, can be translated as witness, which leads to an important question. What is it that these items witnessed? And why is this witnessing important? In Nachmanides' commentary on the opening of the Parsha, he states that the role of the ark within the tabernacle is to make a place for the glory of the divine presence. While the Shekhinah dwelt openly at Mount Sinai during the Revelation, it will now abide concealed from within the Mishkan. To quote Ramban, Israel always had with them in the tabernacle of glory, Israel always had them in the tabernacle of glory, which appeared to them on Mount Sinai. The tablets are the witness of this act of revelation. They preserve the commandments that were given there. Their physical presence in the ark is a constant reminder that the divine presence travels with the Israelites as well. The Ramban's introductory comment to Parshat Truma reminds us of the close connection between the texts that we carefully preserve and their divine origin. According to Masechet Shekalim of the Jerusalem Talmud, these are not the only objects that traveled in the ark. They were accompanied by an omer of man, which we learn in Exodus 16:33, and Aaron's staff that bloomed with flowers and almonds. All three of these items served as witnesses to miracles provided by God to the Israelites as they wandered in the desert. While we no longer have access to these three miraculous objects, the tablets that traveled in the ark represent a small yet significant part of a sacred text that would grow along with the Israelites, preserving stories from the earliest origins of creation to the establishment and reestablishment of the state. Over the past 3.5 years, Rachel Danziger has not only embarked on her own journey through this text by reading a chapter of Tanach a day, she has also shared that journey by teaching 35 classes through Mayan. It is our great privilege to hear her speak today about her experience and share her insight upon completion of this project. Her shir is entitled, The Way Up, The Hidden Story of an Eternal Road. Rachel, we are honored to be learning with you today.
Thank you so much, Zoe. I really appreciate it. I didn't expect such praise, and I feel like it's our communal achievement here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this journey with you. It would be remiss of me, not to thank you, Zoe, and to thank Mayan, and to thank your predecessor, Ilana, who brought me into Mayan, and specifically to teaching 9 to 9 via Mayan. And it's been a wonderful journey, so thank you. It's really been a privilege doing it with you. And here we are at its end, at the very end. And before I start talking about this or that topic, before we start unpacking what's there, let's just read the last few verses of the Tanach, of the Hebrew Bible. Let's read it together. Can everybody see the source sheet? Okay, so it's here in box 1. Just for context, the last chapter of Chronicles B is a very dense chapter. It covers the 4 last kings of the kingdom of Judea and everything they did wrong and how they were punished, and eventually the destruction of the temple and the final exile. But at the very end, there's a hope. There's a hopeful message. And the hopeful message is not told to us in the voice of a prophet or a Jewish king or a Jew at all, or even the biblical narrator. No, the hopeful message is put in the mouth of a Persian king. Let's read it together in the English. You have it in the Hebrew in front of you as well, here in source number 1. And in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, King Koresh the famous, when the word of the Lord spoken by Yirmiyahu was fulfilled, Yirmiyahu made a prophecy that after 70 years, there will be a return to the land of Israel, after 70 years of exile. The Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. And any of you, all of his people, the Lord his God, be with him and let him go up. I will read the last part also in Hebrew. Mi bachem, he amongst you, mikol amo, from his entire nation, Hashem Elokav imo, who with whom the Lord God be, vaya'al, let him rise up, go up. It's a very powerful word to end the book and the entire Tanach on, right? Vaya'al, let him go up. When I say this word, just let's throw some thoughts together. What associations does the word going up, rising up, la'alot? What associations does it evoke for you? Aliyah, to Israel, right? And here it literally means that, go to Israel, the land of Israel. What else?
Like climbing the spiritual ladder, like going up in our journey.
Barbara? Is it you,
yes.
Barbara?
Yes, you can call me Devorah, but yes, Barbara's fine too. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, climbing the spiritual ladder. That's a very powerful association also. Anything else? When else in life do we go up? Naomi, I can see you're speaking, but you're muted.
Also, when you have an aliyah for Torah reading, there is a sense of getting an aliyah, also a spiritual and textual and associated again with Tanach.
That's true. And it's not, I mean, there's also the physical aliyah that you stand up to say the bracha on it, but there's also this sense of you're raising yourself. And we also say, it's comes together with saying that we say, may his neshama have an aliyah, right? We have this idea that when we do good in this world, or say Kaddish in this world, the souls of the departed whom we mourn and love rise somehow through our action. Any other associations before we move forward? Yes.
Malachim.
Sorry. Yes. That Anne, and then Deborah. Yes.
A process of tshuva, and in this case, a national tshuva from Galut to Geula.
That's right, the tshuva, and it's interesting that tshuva is often described as going back up, and there's a lot of midrashim and then Hasidic stories also about how tshuva raises the person and picks you from the mire of sin. And here you're talking about the entire people sinned, were exiled, and now they're given the opportunity to rebuild what they have lost. Deborah. Sorry, you were saying Malachim?
Malachim, Olim v'Yordim, that's another association.
The angels going up and down in Jacob's ladder, where it's very clear that the up somehow connects us to the sky, to the spiritual, to what lies above. One more answer, anybody? And then I'm gonna move on. So, okay, so let's keep going. The thing is, how are we supposed to understand this ending? Are we supposed to understand this ending in the context of the chapter? Are we supposed to understand this ending in the context of the book? Chronicles is a ganze book that starts from Adam in Chronicles 1:1 all the way to this moment of Cyrus declaring that the Jews are allowed to return and rebuild the temple. Are we supposed to understand it in the context of this story? Is this the story in which that serves as our prism? Or is it the entire Tanach? Are we looking at this pasuk, at this verse, at this word, vaya'al, and trying to understand it in the context of the entire Tanach? Now, doing the 929 project can be a very fragmentary experience, because every day we read a very small portion, or if we meet once a month, we take a book, half a book at a time. It doesn't really give us a picture of the entirety of the text. And in truth, whenever commentators, be they Jewish or not Jewish, from within traditional schools of thought or academic schools of thought, whenever scholars come and try and say the story of Tanach, of the whole Hebrew Bible is, they run into one very obvious problem. And the problem is that the Tanach, as you can see in the word itself, Tanach is Rashei Tevot, it's the first letters of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, is a collection. It's a collection of narrative, it's a collection of poems, it's a collection of parables, it's a collection of morality plays, it's a collection of so many different pieces, so many different moving pieces, moving books, pieces of literature, pieces of exhortation. Each of them has its own story. How are we supposed to put it all together? How are we supposed to find a strand that runs through it all? One approach, for example, championed by Professor Yoram Chazoni from Jerusalem in his book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, which I often quote in my classes, so whoever learned with me probably already heard some of that before, suggests that a way that the Tanach is a unified work, or a way to see unity in Tanach despite its discrete nature and disparate nature, is to notice that the storyteller, the biblical storyteller, is repeating certain patterns. Sometimes the patterns are, let's not read it in the source, I'll just recapture it. Sometimes the repetitions are in the plot line. Leaders of the Jewish nation often meet their future wife by a well, and there's something there. And the repetition draws our attention to it over and over and over again, trying to get us to understand a deeper message that returns over and over again. And the differences also draw our attention to messages that are important. Or, for example, sometimes there's repeated characters. The character itself is different, but there's certain similarities between characters. Today, in our class, we will see some similarities, for example, between Abraham and David. And once you see these similarities, you start seeing that there's certain patterns about how certain behaviors earn certain things, and a certain message comes across that's reinforced through the repetition. The Gemara, the Talmud, offers a very different way of looking for a unified picture inside Tanakh. The Gemara, to a great extent, and here I'm saying that all with a grain of salt because this is really not my forte and not my field, but from everything I learned and heard from my Rebbeim, the Gemara, to a great extent, does away with a story context and instead focuses on the words. This word appears here, and here it appears in this context of this sentence, and here it appears in this context. So from that, we can learn that the law in point A applies also in point B. And a word from point B, a different word, appears in case C. So we can learn about a connection there also. And suddenly the network that allows us to go back and forth through this collection of 929 chapters and find a unifying theme there is no longer the network of storylines, but rather the network of separate words that you can break apart and put together in different ways. The way I want to take you on today with me is somewhere in the middle. We are going to focus on words. Once again, we're not going to focus on storylines. We're going to focus on words. But we're not going to do it like the Amoraim. We're not going to do it like the wise men of Talmud who look at words as parts of a law, as relevant to a law. Rather, we're going to look at the way two specific words or two specific roots in Hebrew, through their progress from Bereshit all the way to Divrei Yamim, through all those different stories and all those different storylines and repetitions and laws and exhortations and poetry, etc., acquire connotations, acquire new meanings, new associations, so that by the end of the Tanakh, when we hear those words, and specifically the second word I'm going to be talking about is the word that ends the entire book, vayal, to go up, la'alot, to rise, we hear more than the word itself. We hear more than the technical going up. And we even hear more than our personal associations that we shared in the beginning of what rising up makes us think about. But we also hear, if we read it carefully through the Tanakh and we note the progress of this word in different junctures, we read a whole field of meanings and associations that the word kind of collected like new clothes as it traveled through book to book to book to book to book. But before we talk about the word going up, which after all is a specified form of motion, it's a word that describes a motion upwards, I want to talk about a different word, a word that you will see the connection between the two as we move forward. And that's the word to walk, lalechet, halach, or lehalech, to walk, to go. This is another word that goes through the entire Tanach. It is a bit more general than to go up. It describes motion in more general ways. But as we will see, as we follow it through its development, through and kind of evolution in our book of books, it slowly acquires meanings that then become connected to going up and kind of add buoyancy. Is that how you say this word, buoyancy? Buoyancy? Buoyancy to the word going up itself. So we will start with that without further ado. And let's delve straight into the text and see how the word walk becomes much more than just put one foot in front of the other. Already fairly early on in Tanach, in the book of Genesis, before the flood, in the very first two parashot of the entire Torah, we hear about men who walk with God. We hear about Chanoch. I'm here in box 2. After the birth of Metushach, Chanoch walked with God. And in Hebrew, it's a little bit weird because it doesn't say im ha-Elohim, which is a more common way of saying with God. It says et ha-Elohim. Et is more like direct object word. It's a bit of a weird way of putting it, but commentators all seem to understand it as going with God in some sense. We hear the same about his famous descendant, Noach, the man who is destined to be the great survivor of the biggest natural disaster in history. This is, in Genesis 6:9, this is the line of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noach walked with God. Again, in Hebrew, it says, et ha-Elokim italech Noach. In both of these words, in both of these instances, it doesn't say halach, he walked. It says hitalech, which implies an ongoing process. He used to walk with God, or you could find him walking with God. It implies a certain preoccupation that progresses over a person's life. It's not one time he walked with God. So we have that. We have the idea that you can walk, and you can also walk with God. Later, when Avraham Avinu enters the scene, we also hear about walking as something you can do by God's command. Because famously, the first word that God speaks to our great ancestor Avraham is lech, go, from the word lalechet, from this very same root. The Lord said to Avraham, lech lecha, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Not only does God tell Avraham to go in this instance, later, after Abraham already makes it to the land of Canaan, and God tells him, this is it, this is the land, he also tells him something else. He tells him, keep walking in this land. I'm here in Genesis 13:17. Up, in Hebrew it's rise, get up, walk about the land, hithalech ba'aretz. Again, it's that form of the verb that implies not walking one time, but rather walking as an ongoing preoccupation, an ongoing thing that you do through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. In both of these cases, in both of Avraham's orders to walk, the first walk, which is just one time, walk now, and the second order, which is go on walking in this land that you already walked to one time, the instruction to walk comes tied to the promise of the land. The promise of yours, you will have descendants and they will inherit this land, is tied to this walking. Something about this walking itself acquires the land for Abraham and for his descendants. But there's more, because if we talk about Abraham, another thing comes to the fore. which is that God doesn't only tell him walk in the land. God also tells him walk before me. Let's see it together. Here I am in box 4. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. So it's a little bit of a problematic translation. In Hebrew, it doesn't say walk in my ways. It says, Ithalech lefanai, walk before me. Later, at the end of his days, Jacob is going to echo this. It's going to repeat several times, but at the very end there of Genesis, Jacob is going to remember that and say, and he blessed Joseph, saying, the God in whose ways, and again, it doesn't say in whose ways, it says, before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd from the birth to this day. And he goes on to bless Joseph by this God, the God in front of whom Abraham and Isaac and Jacob walked. Now I have a question to you. We already heard before about a man walking with God, Eta Elokim. What's new? What kind of new association does the word walking acquire when we talk about, instead of walking with God, or even by God's order, rather about walking in front of God? When you think about it, what kind of image or what kind of associations does it raise to you? Any thoughts? Who walks in front of whom in life, in normal life? Anyone?
Shouldn't we be following Hashem rather than the idea that we're walking in front of Hashem?
You're right. It sounds a little bit weird, right? Shouldn't the leader be the one that leads us? And in fact, there are places where we will see it later, where God speaks about walking after me, walk after God. Why should we walk before him? Yes, Naomi. Naomi Baryam, and then Naomi Cherny.
Sorry, our
Yes, Naomi
children
Baryam.
walk in front of us so we can keep an eye on them.
That's as a mother who takes her kids to shul, not during COVID, but that's definitely an image I can relate to, that sometimes having someone walk before you means that you're keeping an eye on them. Yes, Naomi Chernin.
Also, with a king, you also have somebody lower than the king walking in front, kind of heralding the coming of the king. So you have that.
Yeah.
You have that image also.
So what your image is adding, I think that's important here, is that it's not just one-sided. The image of the parent watching over the kid, the parent is more important than the kid. Not more important, but more, has more gravitas at the moment than the kid, right? Has more, he calls the shots, but he wants to watch over the kid. There's a certain one-sidedness to the relationship. What you're describing is that sometimes, even though the most important one is the one who walks behind the king, the herald has a role. There's an active role involved there. It's not just being watched over, it's also playing a role in declaring the king. Anne, you wanted to say something?
But the one going before, both the herald and the child, has to have earned it somehow. A little child you hold the hand of, or you wear in your pouch or whatever. The child has to be old enough, and you have to see that the child is responsible enough to be able to go in front of you. And the herald has to be trusted with the role to carry the light before. Kind of
That's
thing.
a beautiful point, that there's some dignity in being allowed to walk ahead, even as a child, right? Even if you're not a herald with an official role. I'm not trying to belittle children here. I'm just trying to make the distinction clear. Even if you don't have an official capacity like a herald, even if you're a kid who's allowed to walk ahead, that in and of itself shows a certain level of trust.
Right. So you've earned a responsibility. You've gained something.
Yeah, he has some dignity, some of his own, on his own right. He stands on his own right. Anybody?
It's almost like
has
you've
a
earned a
different-
privilege.
A privilege, yeah, a privilege. It's a nice way to look at it. Anybody wants to add something?
I was also thinking it's sort of growth, because if you're comparing it to children, when children are very little, like toddlers, you're not going to have them walk ahead of you necessarily, walk next to them, right? And then when they're older and they're growing up and they're able to be trusted with responsibility and you have faith in them, then they can walk ahead of you. And it's almost like a zichus, like to have a child
Mhm.
walk in front of you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a certain process of acquiring the respect of the people around you and the trust of the people around you that comes with it, the growth. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point. And the midrash catches on all of these associations that you just brought up. Let's look at it together. And the midrash describes the difference here. The midrash takes this difference between Noach, who walks with God, and Abraham, who walks before God, and frames it. Two of the big rabbis, Rav Yonatan and Resh Lakish, frame this difference in very similar terms to what you said now. Let's read it together in Midrash Tanchum Abuver, Lech Lecha 26. It is written of Noach, Noach walked with God. It is also written of Abraham, walk before me. One who reads this might think that Noach was greater than Abraham because there's closer, it's closer, walking with God and walking before God. Before God, there's a certain distance there, but it is not so. Rav Yonatan and Rish Lakish differed. Rav Yonatan told his parable. To what is the matter comparable? To a king who has two sons, one elder and one younger, just like you said. The younger would hold on to him so as not to fall, but the elder would walk before him. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. No, actually, let's read it. Thus it is written of Noach, Noach walked with God. He did so lest he be drowned with the generation of the flood. He's still little. He's not righteous enough to really rise on his own. God needs to kind of hold him and protect him. In the case of Abraham, however, because he was without peer in the world and was righteous, to him the Holy One said, walk before me and be perfect. Resh Lakish also told a parable. To what is the matter comparable? To a king who had a friend. Now we're moving from the image of a child to an image of a friend who was sunk in the mire. He took hold of his hand and lifted him out of the mire. So Noach was sunk in the mire of the sins of his generation. The Holy One saw him, gave him a hand, and raised him out of the mire. Note the word raise, which we will come back to later, the word of going up, being pulled up. Then to what was Abraham comparable? To a king who used to walk in the dark. His friend came, saw him, and provided him with light. The king said to him, as long as you're providing me with light, come and go before me. Thus, in the days of Abraham, the whole world was wicked, while he was righteous. The Holy One said to him, as long as you are providing light in the east, walk before me. What's really striking to me about this last part of the midrash here is that God goes in the dark. God, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient God, is walking in the dark. He needs us to light for him. And here comes Abraham and brings light. And because of that, he gets the role of walking ahead because he can light before the king. He can light the world for the king. The midrash goes on and brings other images about how a shepherd walks with a flock before him and a king goes with his elders before him. But what I want to highlight in this section, particularly about walking in front of God, and here Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are all called upon to walk before God, ahead of God, is that it's not only the verb walking acquires here the association not only of motion, not only of going from place to place, not even only of some intimacy and closeness with God, as it did in the case of Noach, but rather also of having a role in God's presence in the world, in having some sort of an active place, and a place where you earn, the privilege to uphold by taking initiative, by being upright, by being perfect, by going out of your way. And this little tone of initiative, of taking things into your own hands, of being worthy of being entrusted with a job by God, is an undertone that will go on with the word walk, will walk on inside the word walk, as we will see now. Because what happens after the fathers and mothers, after the patriarchs and matriarchs, what happens is a nation is created. And this nation is taught two things. I'm going to skip ahead to box 6 first. One thing that it's told is to walk after God. I am reading here from Deuteronomy 13:5. Follow none but the Lord your God, and revere none but him. Observe his commandments alone, and heed only his orders. Worship none but him, and hold fast to him. And the midrash on this sentence, Achrei Hashem Elokecha telechu, walk. In Hebrew, it's not follow, it's walk. Again, the verb telechu, after God. They ask in the Masechet Sotah, Rabbi Hama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what is the meaning of that which is written, after the Lord your God shall you walk? How can you walk after God? I'm jumping ahead a little bit in the bold, but it is actually possible for a person to follow the divine presence. But hasn't it already been stated, for the Lord your God is devouring fire? How can you follow God? It doesn't make any sense. Rather, he explains, and I'm highlighting it, the meaning is that one should follow the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be he. He provides several examples. Rachum, Chanun, all those midot that we repeat in Yom Kippur as belonging to God, going after God, as the rabbis understand it, means try and be like God.
Is it
In
like
other
Tomer
words,
Devorah? Like the Tomer Devorah that we study?
I'm sorry?
Is it like the Tomer Devorah that we study? Like the attributes of Hashem that we want to emulate?
Yeah, I'm just not, yeah. It's like the Gimel Midot. And the idea is that walking after someone is emulating someone, which is almost literally, right? You walk after someone and you try and walk the way they walk. You see the impact they leave and you try and leave the same impact in the world. But we're not only told to walk after God, we're also told to walk in another very important ways. And here I'm going up to box 5. We're told to walk in God's rules. I am reading 2 psukim. Sorry. From Vayikra Kavav, from Leviticus 26. In one God walks, and in one we walk, and together they form the covenant. In Leviticus 26:12, God says, I will be ever present in your midst, which in Hebrew says, V'yitalachti b'tochechem, I shall walk amongst you. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. So the covenant is formed by God walking amongst us. But what's the other part? The other part is us walking as well. If you follow my laws, which in Hebrew is im bechukotai telechu, if you shall walk in my laws and faithfully observe my commandments. Orach Chaim has 36 answers to the question, why is the verb telechu used in the second verse I brought here? Why does it say, if you will walk in my laws, instead of you will obey my laws? We don't have time to read all of them. I can tell you about some of them, but some of them say that it means literally, when you walk in the road, you should think about Torah. Or for example, if you can't learn Torah near your house, you have a mitzvah, you have a commandment to leave your house and walk elsewhere to a place where you can learn Torah. Some of the other explanations focus on other aspects of walking. They talk about walking as an activity that is all-consuming. When we walk, we use a lot of our muscles, a lot of our body. This is why it's such a healthy activity. We use so much of our body. So Torah should be something that we use all of our body with. We should make it part of everything we do, our entire experience of the world. But the main explanation I wanted to focus on with you today is this one, the 23rd that he brings. I'm going to read it here from the source sheet. The 23rd allusion in the words im bechukotai telechu is found in connection with a comment of the Zohar, volume 3, page 99, never mind. Sorry. On the pasuk, on the verse, when an ox or sheep is born, etc. The author points out that the essential difference between man and beast is that once a beast, always a beast. Man, on the other hand, is able to refine himself into something far superior to what he is at birth. Man's deeds are the key to his spiritual elevation. Man is endowed with greater and greater potential in accordance with the merits he accumulates. The Torah here provides the key to how these merits may be earned. This is the meaning of Ibechukotai Telechu, study of an immersion of Torah, enable one to progress, to telechu. And here we're reaching a key point, which is that to be in a process of walking means that you're constantly in motion, means that you're constantly progressing. Whether you're doing it with God or before God or in God's command or following after God, trying to be like him, or going in God's ways by obeying God's covenant with your people, whichever one of these different meanings of walking you want to focus on at this moment, walking is indubitably, across all these different categories, a mark of progress, a mark of a person who's in a constant state of development. As somebody mentioned before, growth, somebody who's constantly in the process of growth. In fact, this idea, the idea that walking symbolizes growth and progress, was so central to certain strands of Chassidut, certain strands of Hasidic readings of the Torah, specifically the more Kabbalah-infused ones, that many of the great Hasidic teachers taught that, first, this is why man is called mehalech. They said angels are called omed, their stand, and man is called mehalech, walking, because our nature is to walk and change and grow. And secondly, they said that this is the point of life. If we don't walk spiritually, if we don't progress, if we don't become more today than we were yesterday, and more tomorrow than we are today, there's no point in living. And Rabbi, and I just brought this beautiful way that Rabbi Tzadok, the Pri Tzadik, Rabbi Tzadok Kohen Lublin, put it really well. It's in Hebrew, but I'll translate as I read. He is interpreting this verse, the verse from Dvarim Lamed Aleph, Deuteronomy 31. Moses went and spoke these things to all of Israel. He said to them, I am now 120 years old. I can no longer be active. Moreover, the Lord has said to me, you shall not go across yonder Jordan. In Hebrew, what he says, Ben 120 shana anochi, I am 120 years old. Hayom lo uchal od latzet velavot. Today I can no longer go out and go in. And Rabbi Tzadok Milublin says, aha, what does it mean go out and in? Go out and in means experiment, try things, fail, and then come back, go back up from them. Falter, and then use the falter to improve and grow. Stumble, and then take that stumble and turn it into a point of growth. The second Moshe says, I am perfect as I am. I can't make any more mistakes because I can't experiment anymore. I already know I am complete in who I am. It means that he can no longer walk. And this is the last Vayelech Moshe. In the beginning here, Moses went. This is his last going because he has no farther to go. He reached as high as a human being can reach. And because of that, this is the day of his death. Because when a person reaches this level, there's no need for life anymore. Now, this is a very grim outlook. And I'm not advocating deciding that we're done and saying, okay, we're done. We can't walk anymore. Here I am, I'm perfect. I mean, who amongst us can say that, right? But I brought this because it encapsulates a certain strand that we see in all those different walkings that we saw until now, which is the emphasis on process. The verb walk includes in it an emphasis on process. Sometimes it's a process by which you buy your right for the land of Israel, as in Abraham's walking. Sometimes it's a process where you are the little kid clinging to God who's saving you. Sometimes it's a process of emulating God. Sometimes it's a process of obeying God. Sometimes it's a process, and this is what I want to focus on, of going before God, of taking initiative, of having a role, of supplying a light to the world with God's approval. After the end of the Torah, in the stories of the Nevi'im and the rise of the kingship, the great leaders are described as those who walk. Those who walk. Shmuel, David are described as those who walk. And the word walk acquires a new meaning at that stage, the meaning of leadership. And the kings and prophets who fail, Eli, the house of Eli that falls when Shmuel rises, the house of Shaul that falls as David rises, are those who don't walk, who sit, who wait in status quo, who accept reality as it is. Those who succeed, those who become models for the future, and I will show it here briefly, as God says to King Solomon. Here I am in Kings 9:4, I am in box number 8. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked before me wholeheartedly and with uprightness, doing all that I have commanded you and keeping my laws and my rules, then I will be with you as I was with King David. This becomes the model, the leader as the man who walks. And this brings us to that other word, the word rising. Because the word rising not only describes motion, which as we saw is central to our relationship with God, to be in motion, to be in process. The word to rise, la'alot, represents 3 distinct things in different places in Tanach. One thing that it represents, and I'm jumping ahead to box number 11, is leadership. Just like walking before God and the people represent leadership and initiative, rising, going up, also represents leadership. In the very beginning of the book of Judges, the people inquire of Lord, which of us shall be the first to go up against the Canaanites and attack them? So in Hebrew it says, Mi ya'aleh lanu, who will rise for us? And the meaning here is who will lead us. And part of the tragedy of the book of Judges is that nobody really takes the mantle of leadership seriously. But the idea is that to take leadership is to rise, is to walk up. Of course, the word rise has another very important meaning already from the book of Genesis, and that is the meaning of olah, of sacrifice or burnt offering. Olah is that burnt offering that we bring wholly to God, that we devote completely. We don't retain anything back. We don't share it with God. We give the whole thing to God. And when God asks Abraham to make the ultimate sacrifice, to bring to him your son, your beloved son, Isaac, and tie him on the mountain, etc., this is the word he uses. He uses the word lech, again, the word of walking, of being in process, of being in a relationship with God, and the word olah. I'm reading here in box 9, I'm starting in verse 2. And he said, take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go, lech lecha, echoing the beginning of Abraham's story, to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering. In Hebrew, ha'aleu, raise him, sham, le'olah, raise him as this kind of sacrifice on one of the heights that I will point to you. But the word la'alot does not mean only complete devotion. It does not mean only taking leadership and initiative. It also means, through the way it's used through the Bible, going specifically, and this comes back to the very first answer you gave me today, the land of Israel. When the spies tell the people, let's not go to the land of Israel, it's not worth it, it's dangerous, it's scary, we should not go there. Caleb rises up in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, hushed the people before Moses and said, let us by all means go up, alon na'aleh, and we shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. Later, when Jeremiah talks about bringing the Israelites back to Israel, he uses the same verb, raising us to Israel. He says, but rather, as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites out of the northland and out of all the lands in which he had banished them, for I will bring them back to their land, which I gave to their fathers. But the problem in the English is that it says here, who brought the Israelites out. of the nether or the northland. In Hebrew, it says, Asher he'elah, he raised the Israelites from the northlands. And within Israel, it's not like all Israel is on the same level. Within Israel, the temple is where you go up to. I'm reading from Deuteronomy. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your court, you shall promptly repair to the place, except in Hebrew, it's kamta ve'alita. You shall go up to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen. And the Gemara deduces from that, and Zvachim, David and Shmuel said, it is written, then you shall arise and get up onto the place which the Lord your God shall choose. This teaches that the temple is higher than all the places in Eretz Israel, and Eretz Israel is higher than all the countries. Now, this is not geographically true. It's not. But the way the word rise is used consistently through the books of the Bible creates a geography of holiness in our mind. It ties the land of Israel and the temple as a place of closeness to God with this motion of moving upwards, of becoming closer to the sky, closer to the heaven, closer to the divine. Just like the word walking through its different iterations as ways to relate to God and achieve closeness with him, stops being just a technical term of motion from place to place and becomes, through its many usages, conglomerate of possible relationships with God. And now with all of this energy behind us, the energy of motion, the energy of taking initiative, the energy of rising, the energy of devoting everything to God, the energy of going to Israel, the energy of leadership and taking initiative in the world, let's reread those last words again of the Tanach. And now I'm reading only verse 23 here, okay? Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, the tallest place, which is in Judah. Any one of you, of all his people, the Lord his God be with him, our relationship with God, a closeness with God, let him go up. Vaya'al. This is the energy that these words bring here. All those different associations that we collected along the way, all those different usages, the geography of holiness, the sacrifice, the leadership, the initiative, the closeness, all of that boils down to this one word, let him go up. And one more minute, please. I just want to say one more thing. This way of reading leaves a lot to be desired, right? Because there's a lot of words in Tanakh, and if we want to be comprehensive, we need to read all of the words and all of the context and compare them. And it's a bit of a bigger project than we can achieve here in 45 minutes for sure. I doubt any of us can achieve it in a year. But what I was hoping to show you, what I was hoping to do here with you, is to see that words are almost like characters also in the story of Tanakh. And they wear different clothes at different times. And the clothes they wear stay with them, like an echo in the word. And then when you hear the word vayal in the end, it doesn't stand on its own. It echoes all the things that were, and all those emphases on motion and process and growth as important. But note that the story here doesn't tell us, and then they went up, right? It ends before the action takes place. It ends with an invitation, with the ball firmly in the court of the people, but the motion, all this energy that comes with this word that denotes motion and sacrifice and dedication, it's still there, it's pent up, we're waiting for it to go somewhere, and it didn't go. It's not gone yet. And the book, it didn't have to end here. It could have ended with another pasuk saying, and then they went up, but it doesn't. And in that, it echoes another very important ending, the ending of the 5 books of Moses. Because in the end of the 5 books of Moses, which side of the Jordan River are we on? We're on the eastern side, right? We're not in the land of Israel yet. We're almost there. And for 5 books, we have this trajectory being built up of this is where we're supposed to go. This is where the forefathers are. God is taking us out of Egypt in the Exodus. We're going to the promised land. We're going to the promised land. We're there and we don't go in. We're left on the wrong side of the Jordan River. Just like in the end of Tanach, we're left before the people pick up the invitation to rise up. Now, we could say many things about why that is, and I want to offer just one thing as a final thought for our exploration today. Stories that end with resolution are stories that can be put back on the shelf. And they lived happily ever after. We close the book, we put it on the shelf and go about our life. The king said, let whoever wants to rise up, rise up. They rose up, they built the temple, the end, we close the book, we put it on the shelf. By ending both the Torah and then the entire Tanach on this energetic moment with so much energy forward, but not quite fulfilling it, this amazing book that we finished reading now, after 3.5 years, puts the ball in our court. Now it's up to us to take all this energy and actually do something with it and raise ourselves in one of the many ways the Torah offers us and go and grow and become more than we are now. Because at the end of the day, we never finish reading. We may have finished reading the Tanach after 3.5 years, but now we are it. We're continuing being it and growing through it. And may we grow many, many wonderful new seeds and many wonderful new shoots together and apart. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So beautiful.
I think to go back to your original question of what is the strand is us.
Yeah. Yeah, we are the unifying factor. I love that. That's true. That is true. We as the readers, we as the people, we are the unifying strand.
Another connection of Yael and Lalechet is Lin'ol Na'alayim. You wear your shoes in order to walk.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's interesting. It's the same letters. It's a different root, but it's as Ale and Lin'ol. But in Hebrew, it matters. That the fact that it's the same letters in a different arrangement is.
Thank you very much.
Especially in Kabbalistic ratings, there's always a connection there. So that's a really beautiful point. Yes, Naomi Lapkin.
I was just going to say that is such a touching, magnificently beautiful culmination. But the thing that I love the most about it is it also gives us a continuation. So we're not ending, we're still continuing, even though the 929, we've been together for such a long time, but you're leaving us with a feeling of continuity. And I love that.
Thank you, Naomi. I feel the same way. I feel that, those of us who learned together, we taught each other a lot and we're taking it forward now as we move on. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe we have a few minutes of a break, just a breather. If anybody wants to ask anything, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere.
We'll pause the recording. We'll give it a 10-minute break, so we'll resume at 11:05. And I will pause the recording. You're welcome to stay and chat with Rachel. We'll get started with Miriam at 5 past whatever hour in whatever time zone you're in. So thank you and see you in about 10 minutes. So welcome back and thank you again to Rachel Danziger for a really wonderful share on her 929 experience. We now will be hearing from Miriam Gedwiser, who's a faculty member at Drisha and teaches Talmud and Tanach at the Ramaz Upper School. She is originally from Brookline and a graduate of Maimonides School. She has a BA in History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Science and Medicine from the University of Chicago and a JD from NYU School of Law. She studied at midrash at Lindenbaum and in the Drisha Scholars Circle. She has been a guest lecturer at synagogues around the Northeast She's written on topics of Jewish and Torah interest for the Lehr House, the Forward, the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, and the 929 Project. Her share today is titled Turning Points and Points of Return, Noach's Old New World. And before she gets started, I just wanted to let everyone know that the next cycle of 929 in fact begins today, which is why we wanted to bring it back around to Breshit for you. We hope that you enjoy Miriam's talk and that this will inspire you to begin a new cycle of 929.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. So I have a few divrei hakdama, little introductory things to say. First of all, I wanted to thank Zoe for bringing me back to Ma'ayan. I don't know if she's still here. I want to thank Debbie Cram for starting Ma'ayan back in the day. This is like a very, I don't know. I know a lot of you are familiar faces and names to me, and it's really wonderful to be back. And I remember being like a 12-year-old coming to Ma'ayan classes a long time ago. So I'm glad to be here. That's thing one. Yeah, so I talk about it sometimes with my students. So it's hard to even like explain what it was like before, right? Like, why was that such a big deal? Like, you had Torah study classes for women, so what, right? So that's the first thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I gave a very long title. I put a shorter title on my source sheet. Noach's Old and New Beginnings. This was the first piece I wrote for 929. And I will say also that actually Zoe has successfully already inspired me to try starting 929 this time. I started it last time and did not. We got through Breshit, which I thought that was our goal, and we did it. But this time we're going to try more. I'm going to sort of go back to the beginning, and I think that we're going to see through talking about Noach that actually, like, in some ways, the story of Noach is about beginnings and how they are and are not different than what came before. So that's the plan. And I want to acknowledge, as always, I think for me, a lot of my Tanach learning comes from Rabbi David Silver, terrible, who is the dean of Drisha, my sometimes boss, and like I've learned a lot of Tanach with him. I've helped him with some of his books, and so it's hard for me even to pull out exactly how much of what I'm about to say is his ideas, but he's definitely there. If it sounds wrong, I take full responsibility, as always. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning, not the beginning, but the beginning for me, which is source one we have here in Breshit. Right, so we've gone through, we'll come back to the very beginning shortly, but for now, we can all just sort of recall we have the creation of the world. Things seem to be going not so well in a variety of ways. First, Adam and Chava sin, they get kicked out of Eden, they have all these generations, things seem to be getting worse, people are doing bad stuff. God's like, I'm done with you, Noach, build an ark. And then we sort of, Noach does that, he brings the animals in, great. And here we have sort of the first-ish verse of the flood, which is on the 600th year, right, to like of 600th year of Noach's life, right, not of the world. On the 17th day of the month, on the same day, we have Nivku'u kol ma'ayinot tehom rabbah. All of the fountains of the great deep were opened or broken, right? Nivku'u, they kind of like crack open. Va'arubot hashamayim, and like the windows of heaven opened up. So I guess I just want to ask, what do you hear in that phrasing? What do you notice based on what you know about Tanach or anything, sort of that form? It doesn't say, right, it rained and rained for 40 daisies, right? It does sort of say that, but it's a little more than that, right? The sort of the whatever is the storehouses of water below and above, like crack open and everything is like whoosh. That's a technical term. It all goes whoosh. What do you hear there? I think people can just talk.
It's a reversal of creation, it sounds to me.
Yeah. Explain why you hear that.
Because the beginning of creation is separation of the waters. And this feels like it goes backwards.
Right, exactly, right. And it's specifying that the above and below, which is where the water has been sort of held apart since the second day of creation, is now like coming back down. And actually, so I think Rachel did a little bit of this kind of work. Do I have screen sharing enabled? I think I do. I'm going to show a fun tool for doing things. I don't know if people are familiar with this website. It's called MG stands for Mikra Oka Delot from Al HaTorah. Al HaTorah is very interesting thing. They have a lot of it functions as a mikroket. Although I took away all the mafarshim, you can kind of decide who you want to see when you look at something. But we're going to use one feature. We're going to use it a few times today. I think it's appropriate for when we're kind of trying to think about one piece of Tanach as how it shows us for Tanach overall. If we look here, oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. We'll get here in a second. So we're in verse. Here we are. Nifku Kalmeinot Tehom, right? The sort of the fountains of the deep were open. If we click on Tehom, it does this clever thing. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before. If I'm explaining things that people already know, I apologize. But right, it basically is like an interactive concordance. So it will tell us when and where we have seen this word before or not, right? And it turns out that we've only seen this word once before, Tehom, which in Breshit Aleph Bet, right? Before creation, right? When God first started creating the world, there was darkness over the deep and God's spirit is blowing, right? So, right, in addition to the fact that we know that it's kind of breaking the division that happened on day 2 of creation, where the wording is recalling this moment of chaos before creation happens. I'm going to unshare because people have access to the source sheet, right? So when I'm doing things that are not on the source sheet, I'll show them to you, but otherwise I will look at your beautiful faces. Okay, so we sort of, this word recalls the chaos before creation. And as, I'm sorry, I don't remember who said, no, as Ms. Geller said, right, like, you know, it's recalling day sort of, the second day of creation, things were divided and now they're being undivided, right? Like Noach is sort of like living through this undoing of creation. The rest of chapter 7 goes through a bunch of more death and destruction, and everything starts to turn around in one very particular place, which is what you have in source 2. So the very beginning, we can look at it a little bit in context maybe. The very beginning of, at the very end of chapter 7, it's not on the sheet, but I'll just say very briefly, very end of chapter 7, we know right, the water prevailed over the earth 150 days, right? Meaning like the world is covered in water at the end, almost like, and then it's like, oh, but it's not really the end, right? And one thing I'm going to ask us to do later also is think about, we know the end of the story, right? Like we sang that song with our kids when they were little, right? Like it rained and then they went out of the ark and that was the end, right? But like Noach is kind of there. I don't know if anyone saw the movie Children of Men, but there's this very evocative scene, without spoiling, where some people are in a boat at the end, and the movie is very differently depending on whether you know what happens to them after that or not, right? So here it's very similar with Noach, right? Like, let's imagine that we're Noach and we don't know what happens, right? And the world has been sort of completely covered in water, and now we're just kind of like there, right? And he's okay in this ark for a while, but he can't live like that forever, right? So the next verse is what you have on your sheet. God remembered Noach and all of the animals, right, different kinds of animals. Behema is like domesticated animals that were with him on the ark. And God sort of passed over a ruach on the earth, and the waters assuaged is the translation that I have, which I think is what I gave you. 1917.
Which takes us back to early Breshit of the Ruach Merachefet al ha'aretz.
Amazing, right? We're back to the Ruach, right? We're sort of like back there, but as opposed to being a destructive moment, right? Like the Tehom is indicative of the chaos. Many people would read the Ruach Elohim as sort of like the thing that's like the first inkling of restoring, of creating order at the beginning, and maybe here restoring order, right? Very nice. So I'll go back to, I'm going to show a few things just to play more fun with concordances. So we can look at that, right? Ruach, we can see that the last time, Ruach has appeared a few times, right, in Tanach. Okay, so this is not as dramatic. The word I want to look at is this, Vayizkor. So this is one of my Rabbi Silver pieces, Masoras, if you will. The first time a word appears in Tanach is often very interesting, right? It tells you what it means, maybe, right? This is the first time the word Vayizkor appears in Tanach. Number one, Vayizkor, looking at Noach, right? God remembered Noach. So what is Vayiskor? Right, chapter 9, it appears again, sort of like a mention of in the flood context. Here's another example. Number 4, Vayhi b'shachet Elohim et harei hakikar. When God was destroying the cities of the plain, which we know is the story of Lot, right? Lot and his family, right? When God was destroying them, Vayizkor et Avraham, right? God remembered Avraham, and that caused him to save Lot, right? I'm going to skip the Yosef stuff. Beginning of Shemot, Vayizkor Elohim et Brito et Avraham et Yitzchak Yaakov. God remembered his covenant with Avraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What are these? What does memory do? Right? God remembers Noach. God remembers Avraham and saves Lot. God remembers the God remembers the Jews and saves them from Egypt. What is memory doing here?
Lead to redemption, lead to salvation.
Memory. So this is memory turns things around. In this case, for a good thing, right? One of the things I skipped, right? The cupbearer did not remember Yosef, meaning failed to save him. Right? That memory is not just a mental state. It's like it's a change in demeanor that when God does it, sort of changes the direction of stuff, history, whatever you want to call it. So that's sort of our turning point, right? Creation is being undone. We have this turning point. I wrote about it for 929, actually, that little moment. By the way, not by the way, but very by the way, this pasuk appears in an important place in our liturgy, right? God remembered Noach. We have, in fact, a whole section dedicated to
Zichronot in the Amida.
Right. This is the first pasuk in Zichronot on Rosh Hashanah, right? And that's all sort of about that. Remember us and turn things around for us in some way, right? So there seems to be, right, this moment where things kind of turn. And then we can see, as we sort of flip through, if you will, chapter 8, that creation is redone. For this structure, I'm indebted to Rabbi David Foreman, who talks about it. I'll say some of what he says at the end where I might depart. But basically, right, I put here a little bit of a table. This is the high school teacher in me. I like to make charts for people to fill in. You don't have to fill them in, but it makes me happy. So, right, this is sort of like the 6 days of creation. And then at the bottom, I have the other stuff, right? We have the 6 days of creation, then we have Shabbat, and then we have like, oh yeah, that other creation story. There's the snake, there's Gan Eden, sins, exile, all of that. I gave it just one line, but we'll come back to it, fear not. So I will show you. I'm going to put in the chat actually, because I don't like to put like whole chapters of Tanach on the source sheets because like they seem kind of duplicative. But for those who are interested, I just put a link, or you can flip through your memory to chapter 8, Hebrew English parallel from the whole Mamre. I find their interface easy. That's why I used it. Meaning like you can kind of see a lot in one screen of what's going on in chapter 8 and where can we find other things that are similar to our, that look like what we're trying to sort of like the first creation, right? So the memory is kind of like the slip, the switcheroo, the flip, right? And then we're going to sort of redo everything. So for example, right, the next verse is the things that have sort of signaled the undoing of creation. And interestingly, right, creation is undone in like one moment, right? There's not this like nice progression. It's just like, we're going all the way back to day 2, goodbye, right? Like we had this whole nice development of 6 days, whatever you want to call it. But like when you undo it, you could just like, you just push the whole thing over and it's just like a magnetized creation for those with magnetized people or whatever your young people build with. You could just, it takes a long time to build and not that long to kick it over. Source of many sibling squabbles. So, right, so it sort of all got undone, but now we're going to redo it, right? The fountains of the deep are going to be closed, right? That's like our day 2, right? 8-2, right? That the sort of, it's back to day 2. We're going to separate the upper and the lower waters. What's the next thing that we want to see?
Plants.
Okay, so actually Tuesday has 2 things, right? It has plants, but the first thing that happens on Tuesday is the separation of of water from land. So I'm doing this and I'm like making it all seem super organized. The word yabasha, for example, appears later. It's not 100% clear to me that it's really like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I'm going to say, but it does seem like it kind of works that way. If we go on to verse 5, right, the water keeps going down, 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 down until the tops of the mountains become visible, right? So that's day 3, the first part of day 3, right? That the land and water become 2 entities. Right? Then we need plants for the rest of day 3. Where do we find our plants? This is one that's tricky. Or what is the next thing we see that is a rest that is reflective of the initial creation? So then we have this story with the birds, which I'm going to come back to. Right? We have the raven and we have the dove. There's like this whole multi-step process. They go, they come. It doesn't work. It works. Okay. If we skip to the end, it becomes more obvious, and maybe I'll come back here. But if people have thoughts, I'll see, right? The very end of this story, not the very end, but near the end of this chapter, right? If you look at verse 18, 19, for example, Noach and his sons all went out, and all the animals and birds went out from the ark. So that's kind of like our day 5, right? The world is like fully populated with humans and non-human animals. So we're kind of missing a few things, right? We're missing day 1, light and dark. Right, it was dark, but there's no like, then there's light. Okay, we're seeing, we don't have any mention of the heavenly bodies, so they do get mentioned a little bit later, but they don't seem to come back into play. They've been there the whole time, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're also missing plants, and we're missing day 5, which is fish and birds. Anyone, any thoughts as to where we might find those here? Yeah, Rachel.
Well, the dove brings plants in, right? The dove itself brings the
right. The dove brings the plant, and then you could say, if you want to maintain the order, you would say the dove brings the plant, and then the dove leaves and populates the earth. Meaning, before then, it's true the birds are mentioned in the story before the plants, but the birds don't actually go out into the world until the plant life is already there.
Oh, so is that how you deal with the bird coming in out of water?
Explain. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, right? The bird comes first, but the bird doesn't actually populate the world until after there's plants there, which is sort of, in some ways, that's the idea of Bereshit Aleph, right? I happen to really like this. Some people don't like it, but right, if you can, there are many ways of thinking about the structure of the 6 days of creation. I'm going to make a little chart on a whiteboard, which goes like this, right? You could, I think that one of the nicest ways to look at is sort of like 2 columns in some ways, right? Day 1, you have light and dark. Day 2, you have Ma'im and Shemayim, right? The lower water and the upper water. And day 3, we have dry land and plants. Okay, now we're going to have our second thing. So day 4, what do we have? Sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, we're going to have birds and fish. I spent my entire childhood with a kindergarten project of this on my wall, so I'm very familiar. Maybe some of you have also, right? And day 6, you have animals and humans. And interestingly, we also have at the very end, and we'll come back to this, at the end of on Bereshit Aleph, right? It says the last thing in Bereshit Aleph is not like, and then God made people and it was great. The very last thing in Bereshit Aleph is God said, by the way, right? So God gives them this blessing, you know, be fruitful, multiply the earth. And then it says, God said to them, by the way, here's what you should eat. You should eat plants and fruit, and the animals should eat plants and seemingly not fruit, which is an interesting discussion for another time. So that's the end, okay? I think it's relevant to what I'm about to say. So here we are. Animals, humans, and then we could call it the menu, right? Which is that you're supposed to eat plants. So where am I going? Read my mind.
Noah and his sons are told they can eat meat at the end.
Okay, so first of all, this last stage is going to change, right? We're going to have a parallel to this blessing of Pruruvu, but the menu is going to change, right? Why did I make this into 2 columns, we could say? Right, and there are other issues with creation, like why does the sun, moon, and stars appear in the middle, for example, right? So I'll say this, right? The most simple, the easiest parallel is this, right? The plants on the third day, you eat plants, right? The dry land is the habitat for the animals, right? So like day 3 and day 6 kind of are parallel. Any other parallels?
The birds live theoretically in the sky, and the fish live in the mayim on the earth.
Right. Another one of the things that seems strange to us when we read the story is like, I mean, certainly evolutionary, but just in general, like, why would you divide animals this way? Like land animals come after, like the birds and the fish. Birds and fish seem like, why are they together? They're together because they're populating the things in the universe that are created on day 2, right? The land is created on day 3, the things that populated come later. And right, I don't know if populated is the right word, but what sort of like inhabits or personifies or develops further light and dark is the sun and the moon and the stars, right? So like in this way, chapter 1 is like a typology. It doesn't have to be like an order of events. It's a typology where God creates the environment and then creates the things that kind of inhabit the environment, right? And that is going to happen with Noach. So what's missing in the Noach story is this first level, because why does God destroy the world? Yeah, people are bad, right? The people are bad. There's nothing wrong with the sun, moon, and stars or light, right? It's the earth that's going to be destroyed, but the universe is not being destroyed. So we're not going to have a parallel to the light and dark, and we're not going to have a parallel to the sun, moon, and stars in this recreation because they've been there the whole time, right? Maybe we didn't see them, but they've been there the whole time. And we're going to recreate the population, sort of the living things, the plants, right? We're going to we're going to recreate the environment that sort of like the water and the water. We're going to recreate the dry land and the water. And then we're going to have, the plants actually are part of the environment in this typology, if you noticed, right? Like we think of plants as living and they live on stuff, but that doesn't seem to be how Bereshit presents them here, right? So the plants are recreated, then you have the things that live off of them. So that's kind of what's happened, and it's all very nice and very structured. And it seems it's almost like it's going to be the same, right? Like it's like we destroyed it and now we're going to do it again, right? Which is kind of like a thing that sometimes people wonder about. When something doesn't work the first time, doing it again is not always the best way to make it work better the next time, right? So one thing we want to look for is like what's going to be potentially slightly different. Okay, right? So Noach, so far we see the turning point of sort of God's memory is where God sort of starts again with what's been destroyed, right? And it gets recreated in a way that seems structurally very intentionally similar, I would say, but it's not 100% similar. So we'll get back to the raven in a second. If we just look at the table that I gave you, right, what's missing from the creation account is, first of all, Shabbat. Rabbi Foreman tries to develop the rainbow as related to Shabbat in a ways that I'm not sure I'm totally convinced, but it's interesting. And there is certainly linguistic stuff happening there. And what's also missing is the whole story of like Gan Eden that happens after this very orderly creation, right? So can anyone think of anything that brings us there to that Gan Eden moment, right? The sort of the tree, don't touch the tree, or take from the tree, then you realize that you're naked, spoiler, right? You realize that you're naked, and then you have this problem, and God gets mad at you, that kicks you out of Gan Eden.
You just spelled it out for us.
I did, I know.
Right?
Right?
Planting the grapes and getting drunk and being uncovered and the nakedness, it's all right there.
Right, so it seems like it's there again, and you're kind of like, well, what is the point of doing this all again, right? What's different this time versus last time? So I want to say, first of all, think a little bit about what's different, and then think about how different is it really. And then I must get to the pictures of birds because they're pretty. We'll get there. So if we look at we saw in chapter 1, right, that the command to the people is, right, like, or not, maybe not even a command, it's a bracha, be fruitful and multiply, here's what you should eat. Everybody's a vegetarian, right? If we go to chapter 9, very beginning of chapter 9, God blesses Noach and he says, be fruitful and multiply, same words, right? Seems like we're doing the same thing, milu et haaretz. And then he says, morachem chichem, the fear and dread of you, I shall put on every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the earth. This was mentioned before, I forget by who, right? Kol remesh asher hu chai lachem yeh le'ochleh. everything that is alive, you can eat, ki yerek esav, right? It's like plants, right? It used to be that the animals and humans are sort of like the living things. The plants are the environment and they eat the plants, right? But now it's kind of like in some ways, we're giving people more responsibility because they screwed up the first time. I don't know if anyone, what do you think of that? Right, like now, right, we're solidifying the place of humans on sort of top of a hierarchy in a more intense way than they previously were. Right, by allowing them to eat the other animals, and this leads into like, you have to eat them, but you have to kill them first, right? You have to sort of behave in a respectful way. And by the way, just because you can kill animals doesn't mean you can kill people, right? It's sort of like solidifying a special role of humans, let's say. I think that level of, I think it's a little bit of like a with great power comes great responsibility moment, maybe, where, right, initially, it's almost like the initial problem was that people had too little power or responsibility, right? They sort of like, they have this one job, they don't really understand it, they're not really responsible for it, so they just kind of like, yeah, whatever, that looks like a good idea. Whereas here, God is saying like, no, like part of the promise of I'm not going to flood the world again is I'm not going to fix the world again for you. You're actually in charge, right? Like you own this and you have to actually own it. And I'm giving you more responsibility or sort of more power to indicate that you really own it. And I think we kind of see that also in the aftermath, right? The aftermath of the initial sin is what happened. This is very much a Rabbi Silver idea. In the aftermath of the original sin, what happens to all the three participants, right? The man, woman, and the snake? They get, I didn't hear you.
They're punished.
They get punished, and their punishment takes a particular form, right? God says to the snake, for example, you are more something, you are more cursed than every other animal, right? Everybody gets cursed. And we often refer to these as like the curse of Eve, that kind of thing, right? In the aftermath of Noach's sin, or no, I don't know if you want to call it a sin, in the aftermath of Noach's episode with the drunkenness and his son, and probably Ham's sin, right? Where Ham sort of like declines, at the very least, it declines to cover his father and kind of makes fun of him, and maybe according to the midrash does worse things, right? What happens to Ham? I will show us on the screen. So here we are, it's sort of at the end of chapter 9. So this thing happens, Shem and Yafet took the garment, right? Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without, this is very 1917. Noach woke up and he knew what had happened, and he said, Arur Kanan. Right? Noach himself now has the power to bless and curse, right? He's sort of like actualizing that idea that he has more responsibility, right? We see this also with Avram, that one of the things that sort of like he's supposed to embody is the power to bless and curse, right? But so Noach has like more responsibility, let's say, and he's using it. And I guess I wanted to take that frame back, that like on the one hand, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But on the other hand, maybe that there's some message anyway from redoing it and making a slight change that makes Noach sort of, or makes humanity potentially able to do better next time. Whenever my daughter brings home a test, my husband says, don't worry, you'll do better next time. Doesn't matter what she got on the test. But like, right, maybe you can always do, she's like, I got 110. We're like, don't worry, you'll do better next time. So whatever, she'll take it up in therapy, it's all good. So like, right, there's something here about the idea that like sort of the optimistic idea that you can do better next time, even though it really feels very similar to the first time. And I wanted to transition from that to a little bit of like do I have it here? I do, wrong thing. This is the right thing. To thinking back about the raven and the birds. We have our pretty pictures right here. So here's our moment of the birds. It was after 40 days, Noach opened the window of the ark. He sent forth a raven. It went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up. And he sent forth a dove to see if the waters were abated, right? And the dove, as we know, goes back and forth. First, it doesn't find anything, it comes back. Then it comes back with the olive branch, and then it comes back. It doesn't come back at all because it's found a place to live. And then God says, okay, I know that, sorry, not God. Then Noach says, oh, I know that the earth is dry. And then God says, okay, go out. So first of all, what's happening here? Or what is noteworthy about the use of these two birds, let's say, based on the way it's presented? We'll talk about the features of the birds in a minute. Well, I'll put it this way, right? Why did God send, I keep saying that, it's bad. Why did Noach send the birds? Loaded question.
It looks like he wants to know if the water dried out. He wants
It
to
seems like he wants to know, right? That's what it says. So interestingly, where does it say that, right? He sent the dove to see if the water had in fact gone down. Why did he send the raven?
It's actually, I've never realized how really strange it is. It feels like the raven never came back, so he should have concluded, there's some place for the raven to land.
Right. So what did that's interesting. That's a very good point, right? The raven doesn't come back. That's a weird feature of this text. The raven doesn't come back, but what does it do?
It just doesn't come back.
So it says,
It flies around.
right? It goes back and forth or to and fro. So, right, I think that the answer to your question of why didn't he think that the raven just found a home is because the raven just kind of like circling around outside. It's like the birds in the cartoons, right? Like the raven is there, or there's different interpretations of what that means to and fro, but it seems like the raven is visible to Noach. He knows it's not living somewhere else, but it doesn't really come back either. It's kind of like in this hovering situation, which is
So
a
it has
question.
the power to perpetually fly.
Right, ravens are apparently very strong, right? Like unlike poor little doves, who are not so good at flying in stormy conditions forever, right? Or maybe it lands on the ark sometimes, but it seems like there is one interpretation actually it comes back in and out. Like once it's free, it's not going to stay totally inside, but it comes back in and out. But I think mostly it's understood to be sort of going around outside. Yeah, and it's very powerful in that way. So
he sent the raven first because it was strong enough to be able to go farther distances.
maybe, right, that the raven seems like a good choice because it's so hardy. And in fact, actually, in one of the ancient Near Eastern parallels, apparently, right, the raven is the third bird that's sent out, and it's the one that's successful, right? He sounds like a dove and a swallow, and they don't find anything, and the raven is the one who sort of like brings back whatever proof is needed. So, right, like the raven in some ways is like the, the strong bird. So I just want to say a few things. First of all, it's a little weird as to what the raven does and why. It doesn't just come back, it kind of flies around. And also it's unclear why Noach sent him out to begin with, right? It says he sent the dove to find out if the land was dry. Why did he send the raven? So we all assume when we first read it or we remember it, they're like, oh, it's for the same reason, but it doesn't say that. So why? So I wanted to talk a little bit about doves and ravens. First of all, when we hear dove, we all think like the Picasso white dove, and then we're like, oh, like ravens are black and doves are white, and that's the difference. But like doves are not white. They look like this, right? They're like this dove that I have on the picture. They're like turtle doves or whatever. They're like prettier pigeons. So does anyone know any aspiring biologists here or actual biologists? Like, where do these things live? Where do doves live? Ravens are similar, actually. They have these two kinds of birds are very similar. They have some very minor differences.
They live close to humans.
They both live close to humans, and the reason that doves and like pigeons, for example, live close to humans is actually they live in cliffs, right? And like it turns out we create a lot of buildings that are very similar to cliffs, and that makes them happy, right? So they live in cliffs. Ravens also live near humans often, right? We've used things like pigeons or doves for humans have many uses for them because they're good at navigating, right? Raven, right? Like the raven is like the parrot on in real life, it might not be a parrot, it might be a raven on the pirate's shoulder because they're good at land sighting, right? Both of these birds that humans kind of use because of their ability to find their way and specifically to find land, maybe. Except they do have very different associations. Like culturally, and I think that's true somewhat cross-culturally. And there's, I think, two main reasons that they have different associations. One is that ravens sound not nice and doves are pretty. They go coo, coo, and ravens are like, rah, right? And that's not pretty. The other reason I think, maybe the coloration does not help the ravens, but the other reason is that, what do they eat? Right? So doves eat like seeds, plants, right? And ravens eat those things, and they also eat carrion, right? Like dead animals, as far as I know. So that's like, we tend not to have positive associations with things that eat dead things. We just don't. So that's sort of like the raven is kind of that. So I wanted to think a little bit about what that implies. And actually the Radak, who is, I'm going to skip Sanhedrin for a minute. Maybe I'll come back to it if there's time. I'm going to go straight ahead to the Radak for a second, which is on source number 9. Radak and Abarbanel kind of use these features of raven and say, what was Noach looking for when he sent out the raven? Well, he's thinking, right, again, remember, Noach does not know, not only does he not know at first that the flood is going to end, he doesn't know what's going to be there when it ends. What are some options? So we're like, yeah, so he's going to go out and he's going to plant everything new. It's going to be empty and he's going to make more stuff. But like, it was not empty before. What's he probably think he's going to see?
The drowned people.
Yeah, like everything that was there but dead, right? And like empty buildings, right? Which is kind of, so there's this very evocative picture that I put on the last page from Shalom of Safed, right? Which is exactly that like Noach is in the ark, and he has the dove, and underneath him is all the actual bodies of all the people. And if you can, I don't know if you can see it, that these people all have something, they all have little mustaches.
Miriam, could you maybe share that for people?
Oh
so
yeah, that's
thanks.
a good call. Here we are. Right, so can anyone see? Maybe I'll make it big. What do these people look like? Or who do they look like, maybe?
This is very disturbing.
Yeah, right?
Looks like Hitler.
They're like little Hitlers, right? So that's like an interesting, I mean, I'm sure I don't actually know when this picture was made. Did I write it down on the side? No, I did not write down when this was made. I mean, I imagine that there's some kind of like a post-Holocaust early Israel sort of like we're building something on the bodies of what came before, right? Right, but like it's also, there's a lot of like these earlier paintings of like, they're very evocative of like, the last non-Noach family people on the last mountain as the waters are overtaking them with their babies, and they all look really sad. And it's just like, this is such a horror, like, or when your kid first realizes what happens to all other people in the story, right? It's like, oh, that sounds really gruesome. And here it's like embracing that gruesomeness a little bit, but kind of moralizing it also. So first of all, I just thought it's evocative, for sure, evocative. And I think for us,
To
it's
me, it
also
reminds me of the Egyptians drowning in the sea.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That it's somehow, right. It's in some ways it's trying to like clean up the story for us a little bit. Or like that story is like a morality thing. Like that was their fault that they ended up there almost, right? Any other reactions actually before I say more? No, I have to end very soon. So I think, right, what Radak says is that, right, Noach chooses the raven because ravens eat carrion, and maybe the raven, right, just like the dove is supposed to come back with the plant, but that's like a later stage than the water receding and revealing whatever is there. So maybe the raven is going to come back with carrion, or Barbanel sort of similarly, but less gruesomely says, right, that the raven is going to find all the empty buildings because that's where they like to live, because they're like cliffs, right? So both of those I think are kind of, one of my students, Bachi Weiler, Adrisha pointed this out, which I think is really interesting, which is the raven, the things that the raven is going to find as a symbol are these backwards looking things, right? The symbols of the destruction. And the things that the dove finds in the end is a forward looking thing, the symbol of what's coming next. And that perhaps part of what Noach sort of learns in this process is that, right, like there is there is like this, I don't know, infinite regress of like, you always feel like you're doing almost the same thing, right? But that like his job is to not dwell on that as much as to sort of think about what's going to come next and what he can do, right? In some ways, almost the planting of the vineyard is almost him trying to do that, right? Like he's Isha Dana, right? He's doing the thing he's supposed to do. It just doesn't quite go the right way. So that I think is the first message I wanted to give, is that, right, we can see from Bereshit to Noach kind of recapitulates it. 1965, thank you. That painting is from 1965. So I think, yeah, it's very, right, Hitler's very fresh in the memory, and you might really feel like what you're building is really like on the bodies of the Nazis in a literal way. So, right, one thing is that like Noach is kind of recapitulating Bereshit with minor changes, and that the minor changes involve him having to take responsibility for what he does and what comes next. And that part of maybe the message of the dove in particular is that the way you do that is by being aware of what came in the past, but not by using only the past as a guide, but by looking forward. The other, I see the time, so I'm just going to say, if you're interested, There's a whole, maybe I will, I'm not sharing right now. Maybe I'll share in the chat. There's a whole sort of interesting way of thinking about the raven as sort of like a proto snake, I think, or not proto, whatever, like a recapitulation of the snake, who's kind of like this. Ravens are also very smart. He's like a clever animal. The midrash sort of assigns him like a sexual, like sort of like sexual jealousy between him and Noach, or in one direction, which sort of comes a little bit from the snake. You could read that here if you want. I know, I feel like I just dropped that on you. I'm like, oh, like read this really weird thing. But it's interesting. So I'll put in a link in the chat to a piece that I wrote about it, if I could find it. But also I just wanted to, sorry, I thought that I had already copied that. Yeah, here it is. So there we go. I think there's also something interesting about, oops. Oh, not, that was not gender. Okay, so that's that piece. Just one piece from Breshit Rabbah that I think is interesting here. So that's more of the Sanhedrin Gemara. The Breshit Rabbah thinks it's like this, and Rashi quotes it also. The raven, right? The raven is kind of like, has all these negative connotations. He was the wrong tool for this moment, right? The raven was not the right tool for this moment, and it didn't work. But it says, right, this is a midrash on the pasuk says, the raven went back and forth ad yevoshet hamayim, until the water dried out. So the midrash says, oh, when's that? When do you think that is? It went back and forth until the water dried out. When does that happen? Like right now, right? Until, like, 5 psukim later, when the ground is available, then the raven goes out with all the other animals. So the midrash says, no, it's not talking about that. This is also a great 929 moment, because it's actually talking about this moment in Malachim, right? In Kings, where Eliyahu says, by your life, by God's life, no more water for you, right? And he has to run away to the desert, and he gets provided for by ravens. Right? The raven is sort of, he's not ready now, but the raven is available later for a different mission, the mission when there's a lack of water. So everybody, because all these commentators really don't like ravens. So they're like, ravens, there's this whole myth that like ravens abandon their young, all this stuff. So ravens are cruel. So that's why the raven is available for the cruel mission, right? But I think there's also something very interesting there, which is on the one hand, the raven is maybe a callback. I didn't really get to develop this so much as a callback to the snake and a callback to this sort of like the past destruction and some sense of evil. But at the same time, right, the raven is also a sign, right? The midrash sort of has Noach being like, why don't we just like leave this guy off, like with the unicorns? Like we don't, like ravens are bad, right? Like just like, let's like forget to invite him to the ark, and then we won't have this problem. And God's like, no, you should bring him, because even those bad things, right? Maybe they're part of, as you go through things and even as you make mistakes, sometimes you're going to find a use for them. And that I think is also part of, right, like the message of Noach is like, you're redoing things, you're making small changes, and we're going to see, right, then there's going to be more mistakes and more small changes and whatever. Part of what you have to do is look forward to, and part of what you also have to do is sort of like think about possible ways to repurpose the materials that you have, including even the bad guy. So that's thanks for having me. I'm happy to take questions, comments, or reactions.
Thank you.
Great. I think we have maybe 4 minutes for questions and comments. So I open it up, and then we will do the Hadron. Rachel will be leading us in that. So questions or comments for Miriam. Thank you so much for really lots to think about with the raven.
Thank you, Miriam. Lots to think about.
Thank you. I like the distinction between looking back and looking forward, that the raven would bring the remains, let's put it like that, and the Yonah brings the moving forward. I also think it's just a comment that I was thinking as you were talking about what are differences between this recreation compared to the first creation. In the first creation, at least in Perek Aleph, I'm not talking about Perek Bet, man was almost an abstract concept, ish v'ish, like zachar v'nekeva, male and female. God may have created the world with them in mind, but we don't get indication of that until the end. Like there's no intimate relationship. Whereas here, the whole recreation, like you said, starts with the word vayizkor. So it's like a world that's recreated out of a place of intimacy between God and man. And it feels like this would be more of a world of chesed somehow than a world of din, just because of that. And I never thought about how the word izkor is really the foundation. So thank you. It's really comforting.
I would add also, right, like, and this is right, again, a Rabbi Silver kind of thought, but that like there are two creation stories, and I skipped to the sin of the second creation story, but the first creation story, the story of Gan Eden, let's call it, right, is very much more a relational place where people have feelings, and you could be lonely, and then you can be unlonely by having a relationship with a person. You can be commanded by God, and that like Noach is kind of dipping his toe into both, but really you could see the whole story of Bereshit, or even maybe the whole Chumash, is kind of like trying to get back to something like Gan Eden, right? What closes off Gan Eden is the Kruvim, and now, right, only now, like this week in the Parsha, we read about making the new Kruvim, right? Something sort of like that, like it's much easier to create the physical world or recreate or repopulate the physical world than it is to get to that relational moment. So Noach is sort of like the first step towards that, but it really, it starts in earnest maybe with Avraham and maybe even after that. So, thank you.
And Naomi, you're muted.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the artwork. That added a very nice dimension to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like your ideas. Thank you.
It really is kind of a traumatic story, isn't it? The Mabul, like we all focus on the ending, but like that painting really brings home that it's a story of horrible devastation.
I was actually reminded that the Quran, when it tells that story, I can't remember if it's in the Quran exactly or if it's in midrash. I had a class on like Islamic midrash with Professor Sherry Lowen once, which was amazing. And when it tells the story of the flood, one of Noah's children doesn't go with them, and there's this image of his hand reaching out of the water as it's like very visceral. And I think it's what you spoke to, Rachel, of like our version of it. We see the trauma at the end, and it's so clearly depicted with the vineyard and Noach and like what trauma has he gone through that he has to just drink. I think a lot of us take that approach to it, but this Islamic version was very much like in the moment of the agony of seeing all of this that I think is maybe de-emphasized in a way in the Torah.
Right, and I think there is a whole universe of like Noach as a survivor with survivor's guilt and whatever else comes with that I think, especially if we sort of take the traditional view that he's not actually that special, right? Like maybe he's better than the other guys, but like he's not actually that special, right? Compared to like real special people. Right?
God goes with him, but he doesn't go before God, like we said. Yeah. We all inherited that trauma and survival guilt because he's our father, right?
Yeah. I think now is the time we're going to turn it back over to Rachel, who is going to say Hadran, commemorating this amazing event. So Hadran is typically said at the end of a major learning, a Seder of Mishnah, or as many of us know from Daf Yomi, a tractate of Talmud. And this is a very special Hadran because it is a very long project that Rachel has pursued. So I'm going to turn it over to her. I'd ask everyone to please just double check that you're muted while she does this. And we're going to end things with this. So Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you. I just want to thank Miriam, and thank you for ending it with a positive of repurposing, and even the things that are fallen can be taken and reused. I think it's as we start Bereshit again today, I think it's a nice, comforting and anchoring way to move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not leaving us in the travel. Just a minute. No, Hadran. I can't tell if you're seeing what I'm sharing. Just a minute.
Yes.
Yes, you're seeing it. Okay. So I'm reading it in the Hebrew. I'll read it slowly. I've never done Hadran for the Tanach before. I'm very excited. Thank you for being here with us. Hadran alech 24 ספרי התנ"ך, דעתן עלייך ודעתן עלן, 24 ספרי התנ"ך. לא נתנשא מינך ולא תתנשא מינן, לא בעלמא הדן ולא בעלמא דעתי. ויהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, אשר בחר בנביאים טובים, ורצה בדבריהם הנאמרים באמת, שבזכות ספרי התנ"ך ממקראי קודש, ובזכות פסוקיהם, ותיבותיהם, ואותיותיהם, ונקודותיהם, וטעמיהם, ושמות הקדושים היוצאים מהם, ובזכות נביאי האמת, שופטי ישראל, וצדיקי הדורות המוזכרים בספרי התנ"ך, נזכה להיות נועם אדוני אלוהינו עלינו, ומעשה ידינו כוננה עלינו, ומעשה ידינו כוננהו, להיות זוכים היום ביום חתונתנו, ביום שמחת ליבנו, לעורר אם הבנים שמחה, ולייחד סוד תורה שבכתב עם סוד תורה שבעל פה, בייחודה שלם, באהבה, באחווה ורעות. האל הנאמן בכל דבריו, ימשיך עלינו שפע אור החיים לנפש, רוח ונשמה, להאריך ימינו בטוב וביראת השם כל הימים. והערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי צאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ונשמח ונעלוז בדברי תלמוד תורתך ובמצוותיך ובחוקותיך לעולם ועד, כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ובהם נהגה יומם ולילה. יהי אדוני אלוהינו עמנו כאשר היה עם אבותינו, אל יעזבנו ואל יתשנו, להיטיב לבבנו אליו, ללכת בכל דרכיו ולשמור מצוותיו וחוקותיו ומשפטיו, אשר ציווה את אלוהינו. ויהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שכשם שעזרתנו לסיים 24 ספרי התנ"ך ממקראי קודש, כן תעזרנו להמשיך ללמוד ספרים מתורה שבכתב, ומתורה שבעל פה ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה, ותפתח לבבינו הערל בסודות תורתך הקדושה, ותאציל עלינו אור מקור נשמותינו בכל בחינותינו, ושיתנוצצו ניצוצי אבינו רואה משה רבינו עליו השלום, אשר על ידו גילית עמקי סודי תורתך, וזכותו וזכות כל נביאי ישראל הקדושים וספריהם וקדושתם יעמדו לנו שלא ניכשל לעולם ועד. מטפטף אשורנו מתורתך הקדושה, ולהיות דבריהם נאמרים ונחמדים, חיים וקיימים לעד ולעולמי עולמים, עלינו ועל בנינו ועל דורותינו ועל כל דורות זרע ישראל עבדיך, על הראשונים ועל האחרונים, דבר טוב וקיים באמת ובאמונה, חוק ולא יעבור. ונזכה ונחיה ונראה ונירש טובה וברכה לחיי העולם הבא. ובזכות התורה הקדושה שבכתב ושבעל פה, הושיענו אדוני אלוהינו וקבצנו מן הגויים, ומלוך על כל העולם כולו בכבודך, וינשא על כל הארץ ויקרך, והשפיע עלינו אור ישועה ורחמים ממענה ישועה, אמן כן יהי רצון. יהיו לרצון אמרי פי, והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני צורי וגואלי. מזל טוב everybody.
Mazel tov.
May we go on, Michael Lechael. May we keep going on and learn and grow, as this beautiful prayer says. May this be just another step in a long road of growth and learning for all of us, for many generations to come.
Amen.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you for leading the way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Maya.